My name is Natalie Pierce, and everything I thought I understood about work, loyalty, and dignity shattered the moment my manager, Jeff Rollins, said my father's death wasn't his problem. I was standing in the break room of Wally's Corner Café in Knoxville, Tennessee, still wearing my grease-stained apron after a 10-hour shift. I'd worked there for 4 years, weekends, holidays, double shifts, never late, never called in sick. And now, I was begging for 1 week off because my dad was dying in room 212 of Knoxville General. Jeff didn't even glance up from his clipboard. "Find coverage or don't come back," he said flatly. "Your personal drama isn't company business." Those words hit me harder than anything I'd heard in my life. My dad, Lawrence Pierce, raised me alone after my mom walked out when I was 8. He was a quiet man, a man of routines, and the kindest soul I've ever known. And now, this man in a wrinkled button-up and cheap loafers had reduced my life's greatest pain to a scheduling inconvenience. I walked out without another word. Jeff shouted after me that I'd never work in Knoxville again, that he'd make sure everyone knew I was unreliable. I didn't care. I drove straight to the hospital. Dad looked so small, so fragile under those hospital blankets, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the machines. He held my hand, barely conscious. I whispered to him that I was there, that he could rest. And just after sunrise Tuesday morning, he slipped away while I held his hand. Grief hollowed me out. The next few days passed in a blur. Organizing a funeral I couldn't afford, taking calls from a few of his colleagues who sounded shocked, even heartbroken. He worked from home, said he did government accounting. I never thought much of it, just boring number stuff, he used to joke. The funeral was small. A few old neighbors came, and Mr. Doherty from the hardware store where Dad always bought his duct tape. But near the back of the chapel stood 3 men in dark suits. They didn't speak to anyone, didn't introduce themselves, just watched the service with the quiet intensity of people who didn't belong, but were there for a reason. After the service, I walked over. One nodded. "We're sorry for your loss, Miss Pierce," he said, and then they turned and left without another word. I stood there frozen, heart pounding. Something about the way they looked at me said, "This isn't over." Before I explain what happened next, let me ask, have you ever been told your pain doesn't matter? That your life, your grief, your family is just background noise to someone else's paycheck? What I found out about my father, and what I did in response, changed everything. Stick around. You won't believe where this story leads. And if you want to follow it all the way through, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the bell. This journey is just getting started. Returning to work that Monday felt like stepping into a bad dream I'd already tried to forget. Wally's Corner Cafe looked, smelled, and sounded exactly the same, like burnt coffee, fried eggs, and too much linoleum. Jeff Rollins stood behind the register, wearing that same smug smirk he always wore like a badge of misplaced authority. His eyes flicked toward me, but he didn't say a word. The other waitresses, Trina and Louise, glanced my way with awkward sympathy, but didn't come close. They knew what had happened. Everyone did. And they also knew better than to cross Jeff, especially when he was in one of his "don't question me" moods. I tied my apron back on, grabbed my order pad, and braced myself for another shift of fake smiles and small talk with customers who never learned my name. But something felt off. The line cook, Miguel, kept peeking out from the kitchen, and Trina kept checking her phone like she was waiting for news. Then I saw why. A man in a sharp navy suit had just stepped through the front door. He wasn't there for eggs and toast. He stood near the host station, scanning the room with the kind of calm authority that made people quiet down just by existing. His eyes landed on me. "Natalie Pierce?" he asked, his voice clear and commanding. It made my name sound like it belonged to someone important. I nodded, stunned. My polyester apron suddenly felt like a costume in the wrong scene. "My name is Director Mason with the Treasury Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk." The words hit me harder than any coffee spill ever had. Treasury. Federal authority. What could they possibly want with a waitress in Knoxville? Jeff appeared at my side like a bad smell, wearing that forced grin he used when customers might complain. "Is there a problem here? Natalie's just been through a lot. Her father passed last week and, well, she's been a bit emotional. Director Mason stared at Jeff with a coldness that made the air shift. Actually, there's no problem at all. Miss Pierce, can we speak privately? Without a word, I untied my apron, handed it to Trina, and followed him outside. Jeff stood frozen, his mouth open like he'd just swallowed a wasp. We got into a dark gray government sedan parked out front. Inside, Mason opened a sleek black briefcase and placed a file folder on his lap. My dad's name, Lawrence Pierce, was stamped across the top in bold letters. Your father was one of our most valuable forensic accountants, he said. For the past 15 years, he conducted covert audits on corporations suspected of large-scale tax evasion. His reports were so accurate, we based several high-level investigations entirely on his data. I stared at him, my stomach flipping. I thought about Dad's 3 shirts, his peanut butter lunches, the boring spreadsheets he never let me near. He hadn't been some quiet man doing government number work. He'd been building cases, serious ones, the kind that could ruin empires. And I was about to learn just how far his work had gone and how much of it now depended on me. If you're ready to see what happens when quiet strength rewrites the rules, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. The next chapter will take this fight to places no one saw coming, and I promise you won't want to miss what's about to unfold. The company you work for, Director Mason continued, pointing toward Wally's Corner Café, was your father's final assignment. I blinked. The diner? Yes, he said evenly. Wally's is owned by Glenhaven Hospitality Group, which has been systematically evading federal taxes for nearly 8 years. Your father documented everything. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, falsified payroll, unreported cash income, and rampant wage theft. I stared at him, stunned. I'd been pouring coffee and wiping counters for men who were robbing their own workers blind. And all the while, my dad, quiet, unassuming Lawrence Pierce, had been building the case that could take them down. But there's a problem, Mason said, his tone darkening. Your father was cautious. Very cautious. He encrypted all of his findings and stored them in cryptocurrency wallets. Wallets only he could access. I swallowed. And now, you can't find the keys? We've searched his apartment, office, drives, everything. No passwords, no access codes, no notes. Which means, if he didn't leave a way in, those 8 years of evidence might be gone forever. He paused, looking at me with intent. Unless he left it with you. Suddenly, my memory sharpened. The stacks of worn notebooks on Dad's desk, the color-coded USB drives, the battered safe behind his dresser, one I never opened because I didn't know the combination. My voice came out quiet. He might have, I said. He trusted me more than anyone. Director Mason leaned in. Natalie, those files contain detailed evidence of tax evasion totaling $47 million. If we can access them, your father's work could lead to federal indictments across the entire Glenhaven executive team. $47 million. That number hit me like a freight train. I was scraping by on $11.50 an hour, watching my bank account bleed dry, while the people I worked for were hiding millions overseas. What happens if I recover the files? I asked. Justice, Mason replied simply. And a significant reward. The Treasury compensates whistleblowers who help recover fraud-related funds. You wouldn't be struggling anymore. I returned to the diner that afternoon in a daze. Jeff narrowed his eyes at me from behind the register. He didn't ask questions, but I could tell his curiosity was eating him alive. I went through the motions, refilling coffee, writing tickets, smiling when I didn't mean it. But in my head, I was back at Dad's desk, picturing those notebooks I used to tease him about. The ones I thought were just scribbles of equations and dates. That evening, I sat in his chair and really looked at everything he'd left behind. His notes weren't random. They followed strict numerical patterns, Fibonacci sequences, prime number intervals, date correlations. The USBs were labeled with letters and numbers that suddenly made perfect sense. Dad had built a roadmap, and I just had to decode it. It took me 3 hours to figure out the safe's combination. In the end, it was so simple it made me cry. His birthday, my birthday, and the day Mom left. The milestones that shaped our lives. Inside the safe, a single envelope. My name written in his blocky handwriting. Everything was about to change. Dad always told me I was the smartest person he knew, and apparently, he meant it. The safe's combination wasn't hidden. It was woven into our history. His birthday, my birthday, and the day Mom left us, lined up in the exact order they changed our lives. Inside the safe was a single envelope, my name, Natalie, written in his precise, slanted print. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were 24 alphanumeric codes, each tied to a different company name. Glenhaven Hospitality Group was number 17 on the list. The next morning, I put on my apron like it was body armor. But I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I knew too much. And I was finally ready to see the full picture. So I started watching, really watching. Why did Jeff Rollins, our penny-pinching manager, wear a Rolex when we barely had working air conditioning? Why did he always handle the cash drawers himself? And why did tips disappear between the register and our paychecks? I paid attention to Trina's complaint about missing overtime pay. Louise mentioned her health insurance never activated despite monthly deductions. The cooks worked staggered shifts, just short of full-time, to avoid benefits. It was all starting to fit. Dad had left me a map. Now it was my turn to fill in the rest of the territory. For 3 weeks, I tracked shift schedules that broke labor laws. I copied customer logs and cash register numbers that didn't add up. I counted seats, customers, and transactions. None of it matched the books. They were laundering money, underreporting income, and exploiting every worker in the building. Glenhaven wasn't just a tax cheat. They were a well-oiled machine of wage theft, manipulation, and fraud. Dad had known it. And now I did too. But I realized something important. I didn't owe the government anything. I wasn't an agent. I wasn't even an accountant. I was a waitress who'd buried her father and found herself holding the keys to a corporate takedown. So I did what Dad might never have dared. I looked into Glenhaven's biggest competitor, Silvergate Dining Group. They'd tried to buy Glenhaven's assets several times, but the deals always collapsed over regulatory hurdles. I figured I could make those hurdles disappear, for a price. The next morning, I called Silvergate's corporate office and asked for acquisitions. 1 hour later, I was seated in a quiet meeting room with a glass table and no coffee stains. Across from me sat Mara Dalton, their development director. Sharp suit, sharper eyes. "Let me get this straight," she said, tapping her pen. "You have documents that could collapse Glenhaven and bring federal charges. And instead of handing them to the government, you're offering them to us?" "For the right price," I said, steady. She didn't flinch, didn't scoff, just nodded once. "And what price are we talking about?" I looked her in the eye. $47 million. The room went quiet. Then she smiled. "Let's talk terms." "What exactly are you asking for?" Mara Dalton asked, folding her hands. $47 million, I replied without flinching. The exact amount Glenhaven Hospitality Group owes in back taxes. Mara's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't laugh. Didn't dismiss me. Instead, she leaned forward. "Why that number?" "Because that's what justice costs." We negotiated for 2 hours. Mara made call after call to attorneys, compliance officers, and people with job titles I couldn't even pronounce. I never wavered. I knew what I had, and I knew how much damage it could cause. By the time I walked out of that glass-walled conference room, we had a deal. Silvergate Dining Group would pay me $47 million for exclusive access to my father's encrypted files, on the condition that they would manage the legal handoff and prosecution strategy in whatever way served their business interests. The lawyers took a week to finalize everything. During that week, I kept showing up to Wally's Corner Café like nothing had changed. Jeff Rollins strutted around, skimming from the register, shorting staff on tips, barking at Miguel for ordering too many napkins. He had no idea he was living on borrowed time. I thought about Dad constantly, about how he'd spent 15 years trusting that the system would do the right thing, that his reports would reach the right people, lead to the right arrests. But in the end, the government couldn't even locate his files after he died. He died alone, while I begged Jeff for a week off to say goodbye. That morning, I checked my account. The full $47 million had cleared. The transaction record looked clinical and emotionless, just numbers and legalese. But it felt like thunder rolling beneath my ribs. I walked into the diner for what I knew would be the last time. Jeff was hunched over the counter, counting bills with the intensity of a man who thought he was the smartest guy in every room. I walked up and slid a single sheet of paper onto the counter. "Jeff," I said evenly, "you'll want to look at this." He glanced up with annoyance. "Make it quick. I've got a delivery." Then he saw the letterhead. Silvergate Dining Group. Wire confirmation, $47 million. Purpose, acquisition of forensic compliance documentation. Glen Haven Hospitality Group. Jeff's eyes scanned the page. First confusion, then understanding, then pure, cold panic. "What? What is this?" he asked, his voice hollow. "That," I said calmly, "is the receipt for selling your company to your biggest competitor." He blinked, pale. "You? What?" "They now own every piece of evidence my father compiled. Tax fraud, wage theft, everything. Tomorrow morning, their legal team will hand it all to the feds in exchange for immunity." Jeff's face drained of color. "Your father? He was a forensic accountant for the Treasury," I said. "He spent 2 years documenting every crime committed under this roof. The government misplaced his work." I looked him dead in the eye. "But I didn't. And now I'd sold it for exactly what they stole. Dollar for dollar." "You killed us," Jeff Rollins whispered, clutching the paper like it might catch fire and save him from the fallout. "No," I said, untying my apron one last time. "You killed yourselves. I just made sure you paid for it." And with that, I walked out of Wally's Corner Café, leaving Jeff standing there, pale and shaking, holding a receipt that marked the beginning of the end for Glen Haven Hospitality Group. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Within 6 hours, Silvergate's legal team filed preliminary motions in federal court, positioning themselves as the whistleblowing competitor who'd stumbled upon evidence of systematic tax fraud. They offered full cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for immunity and the chance to absorb Glen Haven's market share without competition. The media picked up the story fast. By Tuesday night, Silvergate was being hailed as a model of corporate integrity. Glen Haven, on the other hand, was being dragged across every headline in the country as the poster child for wage theft and tax fraud. By Wednesday morning, federal agents were raiding all 19 Glen Haven-owned establishments, including 3 in downtown Knoxville. They seized ledgers, hard drives, and payroll records. 3 executives were arrested on the spot, including the regional director who had taught Jeff how to manipulate labor hours and launder stolen tips. But the best part? Watching Jeff realize he wasn't just collateral damage, he was personally liable. He had signed the manipulated schedules. He had approved the falsified payrolls. He had pocketed thousands in unreported tip cash. That made him individually responsible for felony, wage theft, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. Over the next few days, I visited every former employee I could track down. Trina was working night shifts at a motel, trying to keep her daughter in school. Louise had moved back in with her sister after losing her apartment. The line cooks were piecing together gig work and side jobs to survive, all while blacklisted by an industry that labeled them unreliable because Glen Haven collapsed. And me? I had $47 million sitting in my account. I could have disappeared, bought a house by the beach, sipped lemonade on a porch swing, and let the past rot. But I didn't. I used that money to launch the Natalie Pierce Foundation for Workers' Rights, named after the man who died believing the system would do the right thing. Our first initiative? Hire every displaced Glen Haven worker. Not as a charity, but at real, dignified salaries. Trina became our operations manager, helping other single moms navigate worker protections. Louise led documentation training, teaching employees how to record wage violations and abuse. The kitchen staff became our field team, going undercover in restaurants flagged by anonymous tips. Within a month, we had filed wage claims against 5 businesses. We won every one. Jeff's indictment came 2 weeks later, and I wasn't even close to being finished. The money they stole? I was going to get all of it back, for every worker who'd ever been told they didn't matter. Within just 3 months, the Lawrence Pierce Foundation had filed successful lawsuits against 12 businesses across East Tennessee, recovering over $2 million in stolen wages, unpaid overtime, and labor violations. We weren't just helping workers reclaim what they'd earned. We were creating a ripple effect that forced employers to think twice before exploiting their teams. Workers started calling us daily, servers fired for reporting safety hazards, clerks harassed by supervisors, janitors docked for breaks they never took. We became the group employers feared and employees trusted. But while the foundation grew, I never took my eyes off Jeff Rollins. His legal situation unraveled fast. Federal charges for tax evasion and wire fraud, state charges for wage theft, falsifying records, and labor violations, civil suits from former employees demanding restitution for stolen tips and unpaid overtime. And the legal fees alone were sinking him before the real damage even began. I attended every court hearing, never spoke, never made a scene, just sat in the gallery where he could see me, calm and quiet, a reminder of how his own cruelty had seeded his collapse. His attorney eventually filed a motion asking the court to ban me from the proceedings, claiming my presence was emotionally distressing to his client. The judge denied it. "This is a public trial," she said. "If the defendant is ashamed of what he's done, that's not the court's problem." As the criminal case progressed, more details emerged about Glenhaven's fraud. They had operated shell companies, funneled money through offshore accounts, and manipulated employee records to avoid providing benefits. Over 2,000 workers had been affected across 19 locations, some for years, all under Jeff's direct supervision. And my father's files? They were the cornerstone of the prosecution. Because of that, I became a key witness. Every time I took the stand, I told the jury how Jeff Rollins denied my emergency leave while my father was dying, how he mocked me for asking, how he said, "Your personal drama isn't my problem." You could see it on their faces: revulsion, disbelief, disgust. One woman on the jury audibly scoffed when I described his response. During civil proceedings, Jeff's lawyer tried to argue that his client was just a middle manager, following orders he didn't fully understand. That's when I dropped the final nail. Through our foundation's investigations, we uncovered internal memos and payroll bonuses, proof that Jeff had been financially rewarded for reducing labor expenditures. In other words, every hour he cut from a paycheck, every health benefit denied, every stolen tip, it earned him bonuses. Over $60,000 in operational efficiency incentives had gone directly into his pocket. The prosecutor brought this to the court during the sentencing phase. The judge didn't hold back. She called his actions calculated, exploitative, and disgraceful. Then she sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. But that wasn't all. The civil judgments? Over $300,000. He was forced to sell everything. His house was foreclosed, his car repossessed, his accounts drained, and all the while, I remained silent, just present, just watching, just making sure justice landed with interest. His car was repossessed. His retirement account was seized to fulfill court-ordered restitution. And before the trial even ended, Jeff Rollins' wife took their children and moved out of state, desperate to escape the shame of his unraveling life. 6 months after his sentencing, I received a letter. The envelope was hand-addressed, the handwriting neat and deliberate, the kind of careful script only people with time and regret manage. It was from Jeff. The letter was part confession, part self-pity, part plea for forgiveness. He wrote about growing up poor, about feeling invisible and unimportant for most of his life. He said that having power over other people, especially people like me, was the first time he'd ever felt significant. And yes, he admitted, denying my emergency leave had been spiteful. He'd wanted someone else to hurt the way he felt hurt. He ended the letter with a question. "Do you think I deserved what happened to me?" I never wrote back. Instead, I focused on the future, on growing the Lawrence Pierce Foundation into something that would have made my father proud. We expanded into 3 neighboring states, hired specialized employment attorneys, launched training programs that taught workers how to document wage theft, harassment, and benefit manipulation. We partnered with investigative journalists to expose repeat offenders and corporate giants that thought they were above the law. By the second anniversary of Glen Haven's collapse, we had recovered over $15 million in stolen wages and damages for workers across the Southeast. Employers began updating their policies just to avoid showing up on our radar. In boardrooms and break rooms, the name Lawrence Pierce Foundation carried weight and fear. But the most satisfying moment came when Silvergate Dining Group, the same company that had purchased my father's files, reached out with a concern. They'd recently taken over several Glen Haven properties and discovered something troubling. Former Glen Haven managers were still engaging in the same unethical practices, skimming tips, manipulating hours, denying overtime pay. It didn't matter that the company had changed. They hadn't. I met with Mara Dalton, Silvergate's director of development, in their new Nashville office. "We want to be sure we're clean," she said firmly. "Would your foundation conduct a full audit of all our locations?" "I'll do it," I replied, "but with conditions. Any violations we uncovered would be reported to the Department of Labor. Affected employees would be compensated with restitution plus damages, and Silvergate would implement ongoing oversight to prevent future issues." Mara didn't hesitate. "Done." During our audit, we found minor violations at 3 locations, all traced back to ex-Glen Haven managers who simply couldn't let go of their old tactics. Silvergate fired them immediately and paid over $200,000 in restitution to the impacted employees. Then, something unexpected happened. Mara called me back a week later, not with a problem, but with an offer. "We want to fund an expansion of your foundation," she said. "Nationwide, full scale, no strings attached." They'd seen firsthand that ethical operations weren't just good business. They were protection. And for the first time, I realized this work wasn't just justice. It was change. Permanent, powerful change. Silvergate Dining Group wanted to be publicly known not just for good food or sleek branding, but as a company aligned with workers' rights. They saw what we were doing and wanted the world to know that ethical business was smart business. They offered full funding for our national expansion. No strings, just support. I agreed, with one condition. Our investigations would remain entirely independent. If we found violations at Silvergate or any of their subsidiaries, we would report them just as aggressively as we would any other company. No shielding, no exceptions. Mara Dalton didn't hesitate. We wouldn't expect anything less. 3 years after my father's death, the Lawrence Pierce Foundation for Workers' Rights had become one of the most feared and respected advocacy organizations in the country. We had recovered over $50 million in stolen wages and unpaid benefits. We'd shut down dozens of exploitative operations, and we'd helped send 23 executives to federal prison, including those who thought they were untouchable. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit at my desk and think about what Dad would say if he could see the impact of his quiet, deliberate work. For 15 years, he trusted the system. He built airtight cases and sent them up the chain, believing that justice, in the end, would prevail. But I'd learned the hard way. Sometimes justice needs help. Sometimes it takes a waitress with nothing left to lose to sell encrypted evidence to a corporate rival. Sometimes revenge isn't loud or impulsive. It's planned, precise, and wrapped in purpose. I kept Jeff Rollins' letter in my desk drawer, not out of sympathy, but as a reminder of what happens when someone with a little power chooses cruelty over compassion. Jeff had written about feeling small, about growing up angry and invisible. But instead of breaking the cycle, he became the very thing he hated, someone who saw suffering and added weight to it. And there were thousands more just like him. Thousands of managers like Jeff. Thousands of companies like Glen Haven. Thousands of workers who'd been told their pain wasn't profitable. My father gave me the blueprint to fight them. I was determined to keep building until every stolen dollar was returned, every violator was exposed, and every worker knew they weren't alone. Our newest case was shaping up to be our most complex yet. A national hotel chain, housekeeping staff reporting wage theft, harassment, and unsafe working conditions. But it went deeper, far deeper. The evidence pointed to ties with organized crime, shell corporations, and political donors with immunity that money had long shielded. This wasn't just about stolen wages anymore. It was about power, systemic corruption, and whether anyone was willing to confront it. I thought about Jeff, probably pacing in his prison cell, wondering how denying one woman a week off for her dying father had triggered the collapse of everything he built. He'd asked me if he deserved what happened to him. The answer: he deserved exactly what he gave others. I just made sure he got it, with interest. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or wronged by someone in power, don't let it silence you. Let it sharpen you. Let it teach you how to build something bigger than their doubt. Don't seek revenge. Build impact. That's the real legacy. And if you believe in standing up for those who can't always fight back, stand with me. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and join a growing community that believes workers deserve dignity, truth, and a fighting chance.